Garrett Blackwood was 17 when the North Carolina Department of Human Services officially stopped being responsible for him. He'd aged out of foster care 3 months earlier. But the paperwork took time, the bureaucracy slow and indifferent to the fact that he was now sleeping in a friend's garage, working 15 hours a week at a factory outside of Asheville, surviving on what little remained of his survival instinct after a childhood spent moving between strangers' homes. The foster families had never been cruel exactly, just transactional, as if he were a tax benefit or a charitable project. None of them had wanted to keep him. All of them had been relieved when he turned 18 and became someone else's problem. But what he didn't know yet was that the inheritance waiting for him would upend everything he'd learned about being unwanted. The lawyer's letter arrived at the address of his last foster family, forwarded through 3 addresses before reaching him. His grandmother had died. A woman he'd never met. Someone he'd never heard mentioned in any of the family's conversations. The lawyer explained, in the careful tone of someone delivering impossible news, that she'd owned property, a piece of land in the Blue Ridge foothills in Buncombe County, North Carolina, where an old pottery kiln had stood for more than 100 years. The property was listed as worthless. The structure was described as unstable, unusable, of historical interest only but present no commercial value. There was no electricity on the land, no water line, no road access, just a mile-long walking path from the nearest county road. The kiln itself was a massive brick structure, 8 stories tall, a chimney more than a tower, built in 1912 for a pottery operation that had closed in 1987. It had been abandoned for decades. Vandals had damaged the lower sections. Weather had crumbled the mortar. The entire building was considered a liability, but Iris Blackwood, his grandmother, a name that meant nothing to him, had left him the property and nothing else. No money, no explanation, no letter, just the deed and a key that wouldn't open anything he could find. Garrett took a bus into the mountains. The landscape shifted gradually, from Asheville's sprawl into forested ridges, into a world where civilization grew thin and fragmented. He got off at a small town called Black Mountain, hitched a ride from an old man driving a truck filled with firewood, and was dropped at the edge of a gravel road that wound upward into the foothills. The walk took 2 hours. The forest was dense, pine and oak and birch closing overhead, the air growing cool as he climbed. He followed a trail marked by faded yellow paint on trees, the path sometimes barely visible, sometimes disappearing entirely and forcing him to navigate by sound, the direction of water, the angle of light through the canopy. And then he came around a bend and saw it. The kiln rose from the forest like a monument, a massive brick structure with a chimney extending impossibly high into the sky. 8 stories of weathered red brick, the color deepened to rust by a century of rain and wind and sun. The base had partially collapsed, creating a yawning gap where vegetation had grown wild. But as Garrett's eyes followed the structure upward, the brick became more intact, less damaged, as if the kiln had endured the worst of what time could offer at its foundation and preserved itself higher up. Surrounding the kiln was the remains of the pottery operation. A small brick building, probably the kilnmaster's office, had caved in on itself. Wooden structures had rotted into formless heaps. But the kiln itself, monumental and broken and defiant, still stood. Garrett's key opened the small wooden door at the base of the structure, a door he almost didn't notice. So heavily it blended into the weathered brick. Inside was darkness, cool air, and a smell he couldn't identify. Something like minerals, something like earth that had never seen sunlight. He found a kerosene lamp in the office rubble, filled it with oil from a can labeled in faded print, and descended. The interior of the kiln was a cavernous space, 8 stories of hollow brick stretching upward into shadow. The floor was brick, worn smooth from decades of use, from the hands of workers who had shaped clay and fired pots in this space. But what seized his attention were the stairs. Ancient iron stairs spiraled upward, clinging to the brick walls, each landing marked by old signs written in faded white paint. Second kiln chamber. Storage. Archive. The laboratory. His heart rate quickened. The laboratory. He climbed. The second chamber held nothing but old pottery wheels and broken molds. The storage level held stacked bricks, dust, emptiness. But as he climbed higher, the air changed. It became warmer. He could smell something different. Something alive. Something that reminded him of soil and minerals and rain. The laboratory was on the 5th level of the kiln. What he found there defied explanation. The chamber was warm, naturally ventilated through deliberate holes in the brick he could see had been carefully drilled generations ago. The walls held shelving, wooden at first, then gradually transitioning to metal shelving as he moved higher through the chamber. And every shelf was lined with jars. Hundreds of jars, thousands. Glass jars containing what appeared to be clay in various states of refinement, color variations ranging from deep red to pale cream, each labeled in careful, precise handwriting. And beyond the jars were containers, some sealed, some open, some showing signs of active cultivation, growth, change, movement. The notes were everywhere, written on papers pinned to the walls, in notebooks stacked on a central wooden table, in margins and sketches and diagrams that filled every available space. Garrett picked up one notebook at random and opened it. The handwriting was elaborate and careful, the writing of someone for whom documentation was sacred. The date was 1971. The entry read, "The red clay beneath the kiln chamber demonstrates remarkable properties for water filtration. When ground to specific particle size and treated with the iron-rich mineral deposits beneath the foundation, it creates a membrane structure unlike anything I've observed in traditional clay filtration. The molecular alignment suggests this could filter contaminants at scale with zero energy requirement. If this works, if this truly works, it could solve water crisis in communities around the world. But the university wants marketable applications. They want profit. They don't want salvation. I'm continuing the research here, in secret, in my grandmother's kiln." Garrett read entries spanning 50 years. His grandmother, Iris Blackwood, a name that suddenly had a face, a story, had been a chemist, a researcher, someone who'd worked at a university in Raleigh, who'd been conducting groundbreaking research on water filtration using clay minerals native to North Carolina's Appalachian region. She'd made a discovery that could have changed the world. And then, inexplicably, she'd quit the university and moved to an abandoned kiln in the mountains. The final entry, dated just 3 months ago, in handwriting that trembled slightly with age, read, "I'm 97. My hands no longer work the way they did. My eyes fail. But the research is complete. The clay mineral filtration membrane is viable, reproducible, and potentially revolutionary. It uses only materials found in this region. It requires no electricity, no chemicals, no complex infrastructure. It could save lives. But it will only matter if someone who understands finds it. I've left the kiln to my grandson, though I wonder if he'll ever know to look." And then, beneath that final entry, "The truth is, I didn't leave him. He was taken from me, and I've spent my life building something worth inheriting." Garrett sat on the floor of the laboratory and wept. Not from sadness, but from understanding. His grandmother hadn't abandoned him. She'd been stolen from him, and in the time she had remaining after that theft, she dedicated her life to creating something that mattered, something hidden, something preserved in this impossible place. She had died 3 months ago. She had died knowing he existed, and she had left him everything. The clay jars were still viable. He could tell by the way they looked, the consistency of the materials, the careful sealing that preserved what was inside. The research was complete. 50 years of documentation, detailed protocols, scientific methodologies, sketches, and designs for applications. It was a complete, comprehensive map to solving a global water crisis. But Garrett didn't announce it. Instead, he began to understand what his grandmother had understood, that sometimes the most important discoveries are the most dangerous discoveries, and that sometimes power, real power, lies in knowledge that hasn't yet become commodified. He called a number from one of his grandmother's journals. Doctor, Helena Winters picked up on the third ring. I knew Iris for 40 years, the woman said, after Garrett explained what he'd found. We were colleagues once. She was brilliant. She was also running from something, or someone. She made enemies in the scientific community by walking away, by refusing to publish, by protecting her research. There was a pause. Tell me where you are. Dr. Winters arrived 5 days later, a woman in her early 50s with intelligence in her eyes and caution in her movements. She examined the laboratory with the reverence of someone visiting sacred ground. This is everything, she said, running her hands along the jars. This is the future of water purification in underdeveloped regions. This is the end of waterborne disease in communities without infrastructure. This is... She stopped. This is exactly what Iris promised to protect. But Nicholas Hartford got there before any public announcement could be made. He arrived in a black SUV with 2 associates, all wearing suits, all carrying briefcases that suggested legitimacy and legal authority. Hartford was the CEO of Pearltech Solutions, a water treatment corporation with operations in 40 countries. He represented a consortium of international investors who had been aware of Iris Blackwood's research for decades, he explained. They had always believed she'd hidden her work somewhere. Finding her grandson, finding the kiln, finding the laboratory. This was an answer to a prayer. We're offering $2 million, Hartford said, standing in the laboratory chamber, his leather shoes clicking against brick as he walked. For the research, the specimens, the documentation, all of it. You're 17. You could have a life. You could go to college. You could be free. $2 million. It was wealth beyond Garrett's comprehension. It was safety, escape, freedom from poverty and foster care and the life of being unwanted. He said, no, you don't understand what you're protecting. Hartford replied, his voice dropping, becoming colder. This research has value that you can't possibly appreciate. And there are channels, legal channels, to claim intellectual property that was conducted with university resources. I could challenge this claim in court. I could make this very complicated for a 17-year-old with no parents and no legal representation. Dr. Winters stepped forward. I'm her legal representative now, she said, producing documents that showed she'd been authorized by Iris's will to oversee the research. And I'm telling you that the research is not for sale, not at any price. What followed was the most unexpected part. Community rallying around him. Dr. Winters contacted colleagues, scientists who'd admired Iris for decades but had never known where her research had gone, environmental protection groups, water crisis advocacy organizations, regional universities. The story began to spread. Not widely at first, but with gathering momentum. Of a young man in the Blue Ridge who'd inherited his grandmother's secret laboratory, and a water purification breakthrough that could change the world. Hartford's legal threats became meaningless when the research was simultaneously published in 6 peer-reviewed scientific journals, when environmental groups filed for protected site designation, when a documentary filmmaker started filming, when the media descended on the small town of Black Mountain, asking questions about the kiln and the research and the man who'd walked away from $2 million to protect his grandmother's legacy. But more than that, the research was replicated. Independent scientists confirmed the clay mineral filtration membrane worked exactly as Iris's documentation described. Universities began investigating applications. NGOs in water-scarce regions began testing implementations. The knowledge that had been hidden in a kiln for 50 years became freely available to anyone who needed it. Impossible to monopolize, impossible to exploit. Garrett remained at the kiln. He worked with researchers, learned the science his grandmother had pioneered, understood the molecular mechanisms that made clay from North Carolina's clay-rich soils capable of filtering water to standards higher than most industrial systems. He earned his high school diploma through online classes, then began college at a local university while maintaining the laboratory. The kiln became a research station. The laboratory became a museum. The broken structures around it were restored. The path from the road was widened into a proper walking trail. The property that was listed as worthless became a pilgrimage site for scientists, engineers, and people whose lives had been changed by access to clean water. Garrett kept his grandmother's notebooks in order. He gave tours of the laboratory. He watched as others continued what Iris had started, improving on her work, designing applications that brought water purification to villages that had never had it, to refugee camps, to disaster zones, to places where clean water had always been a luxury. His grandmother had spent 50 years in isolation, protecting work that no institution wanted, that no corporation could exploit, that she knew would save lives if the world ever became ready to receive it. She had given up everything, her career, her acclaim, the life she should have had, to build something that mattered. She had not abandoned him. She had built him a legacy. In the mountains of North Carolina, where the brick kiln stood against the sky, a 17-year-old who thought himself unwanted discovered that he'd been loved in the most profound way possible. Through the dedication of someone who'd spent her life building a future worth inheriting. When you discover something hidden that was built specifically for you, how do you honor the person who built it, especially when that person is someone you never knew?